at the point. And when we come back, as the global climate cools towards China and countries turn inward, we look at what Chinese companies are doing to keep globalization going. Stay with us. Welcome back. With the world still gripped by coronavirus, global trade and cooperation has slowed so much. The future of globalization seems to hang in the balance. Still struggling with the effects of the pandemic, and with global supply chains are compromised and access to foreign markets still complicated, many countries have naturally turned their focus inward. So as one of the first to emerge from the pandemic, China is keen to get the global economy back on its feet. And the central government continues to emphasize the importance of international cooperation and multilateralism. But how can Chinese companies turn this message into action? How much is possible, given that many countries are still focused on their own outbreaks? What other means are available to encourage cooperation? To talk more about these, I'm now joined by Isbrand Ho, Managing Director of BYD Europe, and Ms. Wang Dan, Chief Economist at China's Seng Bank. Great to have you both with us. So, the Chinese government champions international cooperation and multilateralism, but how does this play out on the ground? Mr. Ho, let me start with you. You are from the industry. Is your company playing a part in delivering this message?
Well, we are indeed. We have been, by the way, thank you very much, Julian, for having me on the program today. The company BYD, we have been on the ground actually since 1998 in Europe. The company is only 25 years old by all measures. You know, in the European context, it's a very young company. But since that time, we have established ourselves quite well in Rotterdam, being our head office in Europe. We have 2 factories, one in Hungary and one in France. We also have a partnership in Scotland with a company, Alexander Dennis, creating the double-decker buses that you see running around in London. And I think we have done relatively well by being humble, listening to what the customers want, and talking to the right people in the industry. And that's been our pretty much formula so far.
Yeah, that's a good example of the many Chinese companies that are pioneering international cooperations at the time. Professor Wang, let me also bring you into this. Now, China has focused on getting the Belt and Road Initiative off ground in recent years. Among other goals, the initiative seeks to encourage bilateral trade between China and the rest of the world. But so far, how successful has it been in this regard? I mean, we've been hearing some complaints from some countries of the promise of this initiative that has not been realized. I mean, has the benefit been more to China and Chinese companies? How are you looking at this?
When it comes to the bilateral trade relations between China and the BRI countries, they usually take 2 forms. And one form is usually considered between China and most countries in Africa, Central Asia, and Middle East. And those countries are usually producers of agricultural goods and other commodities. So when they import from China, they import more of a higher value added machinery, electronics, but when they export to China, it's usually lower value added. So it's quite natural for them to run a trade deficit with China. But the second form, which is more important in terms of trade volume, is between China and ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, Indonesia. And a typical trade pattern is usually China produce intermediate goods first and then export to ASEAN, and then ASEAN countries produce final goods and export to Europe and the US. So this trade pattern is more balanced, and we consider this as a more of a profound, pronounced trade relation. But whatever form it might take, the bilateral trade relation is not intentional, it's not by design, it's mostly determined by the economic structure of the country and also where it is along the global supply chain.
Yeah. Now, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on businesses everywhere, especially on multinationals like BYD. So, Mr. Ho, how have your operations been affected by the pandemic, and how have you responded?
Well, we're certainly very sorry for all the death in the last 8 to 10 months in the world, and we also have suffered somewhat from the pandemic. Fortunately, through the leadership of our chairman, we have moved over to PPE supplying to the world. So far, we have supplied more than 50 million masks per day and to 70 different countries around the world. And I think that switch in the dynamics of business is able to help BYD to survive quite well during the first half of the year. And I think that dynamism and the flexibility in business, it's a typical example of the Chinese enterprises. So meanwhile, we have suffered in the traditional business in automotive and electric vehicles. But otherwise, on the PPE, we're able to gain some additional ground from that. So we're very fortunate for that.
Now, recently, Chinese firms and investors have also come under increased pressure abroad. Professor Wang, companies like Huawei and ByteDance, they have been subject to increased scrutiny and even bans in a growing number of countries. How do these developments affect the outlook of Chinese companies working internationally? How will this affect their ability to do business moving forward?
It is certainly a big blow for those Chinese companies which had intention to go overseas, especially targeting the American market. And so far, America is still on the top, probably one of the highest commercial value market for Chinese tech companies. But the legal cost of doing business there is getting really high. I'm afraid that many of the Chinese companies may have to change their strategies, and that is sort of following this dual circulation strategy. Many of them will have to turn their eyes more inward and focus on domestic market while seeking opportunities overseas. And a lot of those overseas markets will be in Asia, in Africa, and other Belt and Road countries.
Yeah, Mr. Ho, let me also get your take on how your company is responding to this international climate. Relations now between China and other parts of the world are becoming more strained. Now, while the United States normally gets most of the attention, India, Australia, Canada, Europe, they have also become more skeptical, especially after the pandemic. So what are the sources of the strain, and what does it mean for your operations in Europe? Are you experiencing less willingness to partner or cooperate?
Well, I think it's rather unfortunate that a lot of businesses are affected by the political climate. It is a true story that is happening around the world. What we have done in the past is we cooperate with universities, with startups, with the local government, to making sure that we don't become a threat to the local businesses. And that has been a successful formula for us. I mentioned earlier that we have a joint cooperation with Alexander Dennis in Scotland, and we have just reaffirmed our commitment for the next 5 years. So this is something that we are very happy about. We're working with small and medium-sized businesses. We have a facility in Hungary, for example, building buses and utilizing many of the local facilities and parts producers. And I think the fact that we are not saying that, listen, we are a Chinese company coming over to take over business, but rather than bringing the Chinese know-how, the Chinese design, and working with the local partners. And that has worked out quite well for us. Now, granted, there are some tenders being delayed, but that's affecting not only Chinese companies, but other companies as well.
Yeah. I also want to talk about another issue. Another major development carried out by China is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Professor Wang, how do Chinese firms work with the bank, and in turn, how might companies involved with the bank collaborate abroad?
A simple statement of this relationship is that through an open bidding process, Chinese company will win a project somewhere in the world, and then they can apply for the AIIB low-cost loans if they're eligible. And I think through this process, the transparency is really the key. There has to be a fair assessment of the environmental evaluation and how this kind of project would affect the local job market. And we have to also realize that the AIIB function has already gone way beyond just infrastructure building. Especially after the coronavirus, we have seen that the AIIB set aside a special fund to support the building of local schools, local hospitals, as well as roads and bridges to help fight the coronavirus. And the companies also need to seek these new opportunities and get involved in helping the economy to get recovered.
And lastly to you, Mr. Ho, during his recently concluded trip to Europe, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said he hoped an investment deal between Europe and China could be finalized by the end of the year. Now, the deal has been under discussion for many, many years without success. But if a deal can be concluded, how will companies like your company benefit?
It is true that it's been in discussion for many years. business is about trust. And if this deal can be concluded, it's a further step towards gaining additional trust from our European partners. And I've mentioned some of the names before, and I think this further reaffirms the fact that we're committed to the market, we're committed to the investment into the European market, and we're looking forward to the fruition of that deal.
All right, thank you very much. And many thanks to Mr. Isbrand Ho, Managing Director of BYD Europe, and Ms. Wang Dan, Chief Economist at China's Seng Bank. That's going to do it for this edition of The Point. And as always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liuxin in Beijing. Download the CGTN app to watch our show, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you so much for your company. We'll see you same time tomorrow. Bye for now.